Okay, mic check, 2, 3.
Check 1, check 2.
Yeah, we're getting good. Don't look at it.
Don't look at it. That's right, I always forget.
And we're live. Okay.
All right.
Hello, man. Welcome back. This is an unscheduled break, actually.
That's right. It wasn't planned.
We might save that for another episode, but I'm not actually sure how much I need to talk about it. I got the COVID. It wasn't that bad. It only lasted about a week.
Yep.
I am now over the COVID, and I have a second shot of a vaccine in me.
Nice. You are one of the lucky few.
Yeah, so far.
So far, that's great.
Apparently, there's going to be some trouble with that in Canada. But
yes, we've been hearing about that. But anyway, I'm glad you're feeling good, and Janine's feeling good, and our household went through a quarantine. Yeah. Our household went through a quarantine, but it's over now, and we can rejoin the public. So
yeah, buddy, we're free.
We're free.
So today is the 29th of January.
That's right.
2021. Just before 6 o'clock, 5:58 p.m.
Nice.
And we are back at it again. And we thought today we might talk a little about the Eco Justice Food Network.
Yeah, the Eco Just Food Network. Absolutely.
This is a very youth thing. I have a lot to say about sort of the political side of this. But,
absolutely.
And sort of the implications, or less the implications, but more the ideas that are surrounding the project.
For sure, of course.
But why don't you start us off? Like, what is the Eco Just Food Network?
Absolutely. Just a brief kind of rundown of the history of it. So,
of course.
A couple of the groups I've been involved with helped to put together a urban-rural emergency food forum every year. And the purpose...
Urban-rural emergency food forum.
That's what it's called.
Right.
And the idea with that is to connect farmers and food providers in rural areas with folks doing food advocacy and food justice and food networking in the city, food policy as well. So that's the goal of it. And that's been happening for a few years. This last year, in March of 2020, we held the forum, and it was the first time, of course, that we had the theme of a pandemic resilient food system. So not only was it about how to improve our food system, but how to make sure our food system kept functioning, kept supporting vulnerable people within it during the pandemic. So that was the whole goal of this food system, of this urban-rural dialogue that happened.
Got it.
73 different organizations, and that includes farms, that includes individuals, and that includes larger organizations, both from the city of Toronto and the surrounding areas and more rural areas in the GTA and beyond, joined in. Now, out of that, there were many good conversations, but out of that came this idea that if we want to keep the conversation going, we have to create something beyond just the forum itself. We have to create a kind of network that keeps people in touch and keeps us focused on the various projects that came as a result of this forum. And
so the forum was like a yearly thing, and it was seeing some success.
It's seen some success, exactly. And then out of that, interested parties formed what came to be known as the Eco Just Food Network. And so that's what exists now, and that arrived as a result of this last forum. So the Eco Just Food Network, 73, if not more. There's more now because more people have found out about it. Organizations are plugged into the network. They're not all active, of course. There's about a team of, I would say, 4 core members, and then about 10 members who are semi-active as well. And the people involved now are folks who are doing food advocacy on the ground within Toronto. We have 2 to 3 farmers as well. And we also have a bunch of people doing food policy at various levels of the power structures that we have. So
what's the actual structure of the Eco Just?
Yeah, absolutely. So are you
guys a business, or you're a co-op?
Right now we are just a nonprofit. I think we're classified as a charity organization, charity nonprofit. So you can donate to us. It's tax deductible if you so choose. And as it stands now, one there's kind of three different things we're trying to focus on as an organization.
Got it.
So the first one is something called the Food Corps project, and that's core as in CORPS.
Like a body.
Like America, exactly, like a body. And this was, what I participated in over the summer, which was this idea that the forum identified a need. And the big need, and for me, one of the big takeaways is that you have people struggling in the city to get affordable food because laborers can't go out to farms. Farmers have planted all of this crop from the previous season, but they do not have the laborers because of pandemic restrictions to actually harvest it. So farmers were last year actually plowing under perfectly good crops simply because they did not have the time or the people power to harvest it.
Right.
So the Food Corps team was this idea of taking people, training them on how to do farm labor from the city, having them go out to these farms, help the farmers harvest, and then take a portion of that harvest back into the communities that they serve or come from. So that's the idea. And although it was really small scale last year, it was a success.
Right.
It was a success. We actually went to farms, did that labor exchange. Farmers were happy, people were happy, and we brought the food back to the city.
And so that's the basic model that you guys are looking for. So basically, you get people from inside the city.
Yeah.
They go outside. They help these farmers harvest some food.
Exactly.
And then you guys bring it back into the city.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's the Food Corps. That's the first thing we're focusing on.
Is this like a volunteer setup or?
Right now it's a volunteer. We'd like it to be more than a volunteer. We've applied for a lot of different grants to help compensate people for their time. And one of the big things that we're kind of trying to do. So for example, for me, I got funding from Canada Summer Jobs from the government to do this kind of work.
Right.
So I was compensated for my time that way. So that's another kind of idea we're trying to use. Is there like any way we can find people within existing organizations who can bill their hours towards doing this type of project? Does it fit in with their needs as well?
Right.
Yeah. So that's the Food Corps. That's in a nutshell. And then there's the other another area is the advocacy side, and you just read the open letter.
Right. So these are your three goals. You have the first is the Food Corps, and the second is the advocacy.
It's the advocacy, and then the third is some kind of social media presence.
Right. So and then the advocacy is. So let's talk a little.
Sure.
More about
Yeah. Let's go into the advocacy. Absolutely.
So what is that? You just have a website and you're spreading information about the Food Corps, or what's going like?
Absolutely.
What's the setup there?
So the setup is we released an open letter, and the open letter came actually before the Food Network was named and created. And
right. So that's what I just read.
Yeah.
So
where did the
open letter come from?
So the open letter that was addressed to members of the municipal and provincial governments came out of these discussions between these 73 different organizations.
Right. At the, give me the name again. The
Emergency Rural Urban Food Forum.
Let's call it the Food Forum.
Let's call it the Food Forum.
Right.
Super easy. Yeah, exactly.
So you guys met at the Food Forum, and
That's
then
right.
what you produced was this open letter.
What we produced was this open letter.
Got it.
And there were a handful of people who contributed at various levels, but all of the people from the 73 different organizations had a chance to contribute, comment, and give their feedback on this open letter.
Perfect. So maybe with a little help from the
of course, we got it right here.
If you need it, run me through the major points.
So there's 4 major points that were called for in the open letter. One is the immediate action and investment in repurposing and improving local land. So kind of the resources that we have already.
So improving local land.
Yeah.
Okay. In order to produce food.
Exactly.
Presumably, yeah.
And then the second point is the support for organizations, co-ops already doing this kind of work.
Right, makes sense.
So making sure that they get what they need. The third is ensuring that adequate income, safe working conditions are met for the people within our food system.
Right.
And then the fourth point, the last one, is that there's cooperation between civil services, civil society, and the existing infrastructure within our food system.
In order to do what?
in order to accomplish these goals, these previous goals.
So, the whole thing is really just devoted towards, like, turning local land into sort of farmland.
Yeah, and part of it as well is sort of responding to the threats that this pandemic specifically pose already on our problematic food system. So do you think it's helpful if I just go into like a brief little background about like some of the pandemic's effects on the food system? Is that helpful? Or we don't need to talk about that right now.
Well, because that gives us kind of an overview. So far, we kind of have an overview.
Yeah, we have exactly
of the advocacy. So I guess let's play some marker here, because there's clearly, like, this is kind of the most sort of atomized version of it, I think.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of like issues, and then the actual debate that occurred within the food forum in order to decide that these were the four most important things.
Exactly.
Is clearly still sort of a debate. You know?
Yes, absolutely.
That's something that's the part that I think I'm most interested in.
Yeah,
talking
let's go into that. Yeah.
So let's maybe before we jump into that, let's cover your third point. So you have advocacy, and then you also have some sort of social.
Yeah. So, and this is the idea of kind of a network. Like we talked about how we wanted to sort of, I guess to illustrate is a problem that we talk about is like when you talk about and say something like our local food system is in crisis, if people aren't literate in current food policy issues within their local region, within Ontario, we run up into the same problem. Well, if there's a food crisis, why are the grocery store shelves full? It's a very kind of, basic, but very important point that we've run up against is that the kind of food crisis that we're in isn't readily visible to a lot of people.
Right.
So one of the ideas of the network is sort of telling the story about why we think this work is important, how to communicate this message about actually there are really challenging things happening in our food system that you as a consumer of food should care about and should support us. So that's kind of the third idea, sort of telling the story of what we're trying to do and trying to communicate it.
You have this project, you have the core project.
That's right.
The Food Corp project. You have this open letter.
Yeah.
And you
advocacy
have
piece, yeah.
this way of advocacy piece. Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
But yeah.
And
okay.
You have this way of trying to practice sort of engagement with people and get more organizations and more people on the same page with these issues.
Exactly.
Cool.
So those are the three chunks.
So I think we can mark that pretty good there.
Perfect.
And then I guess the interesting bit for me is, because I don't, like, you have your four, nothing about your four goals seems problematic to me in the slightest.
Right.
I think the most interesting one in a way is number 3, I think.
Yeah.
So I guess we should run through them from the top again.
Yes.
So improving local land, supporting organizations that improve local land,
right.
Ensuring adequate incomes, safe working and healthy living conditions for all farmers and food system workers, and then collaboration between civil services, civil society, to allocate resources and infrastructure for local healthy food systems. So basically it's kind of like we should take care of local land. We should support organizations that take care of local land. Then you jump to number 4, which is we should have civil society help take care of local land. And then number 3 is the one that is sort of more different from it.
Yeah, that you kind of see as sort of what jumped out at you from this letter.
Yes. So number 3 is interesting. Adequate incomes, safe working and healthy living conditions for all farmers, guaranteed for all farmers and food system workers. So all of these, I think, are interesting. The whole debate behind it. Yeah. That's where I have some nitpicks and some stuff that I think we can totally get into.
Absolutely.
Number 3 is interesting because this is something that I feel should apply to more than just food workers.
Yes.
So it's clearly a very politicized statement right now.
Absolutely.
The sort of movement for people to be for a living wage.
That's right.
There's talk in the states of Joe Biden raising the minimum wage. I think Nova Scotia just raised their minimum wage. that this sort of feeds directly into that conversation, but it's more localized towards the people who came up with it.
Absolutely.
The way it seems, which isn't too surprising.
That's right.
So I think this is a really interesting point, but I also think, it's clear that this is sort of a subsection of other advocacy.
Right.
And to me, I just think it's interesting because this is clearly something that we want for everybody.
Right.
It isn't just like a food worker thing.
Right.
It's a people thing.
It's a people thing, exactly.
So how do you think this like fits into these other?
No, for sure. So, kind of when you remember this, when we were talking about this back in March, there wasn't the same literacy that we have today, where we know.
Well, for example, sorry, let me...
Go ahead.
Would you collaborate with people looking to, for example, create a universal basic income?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Right.
And in fact, Josephine Gray, who's one of the core organizers, co-founders, and one of the key people who contributed heavily to this open letter, is heavily involved with the basic income movement.
Right.
So, and it's, as we've talked about in the past, this is structured to align with a broader human rights framework that should be applied to society. Things that involves policy options like a basic income, like paid sick leave, all of these other sort of attributes that would be involved in safe working conditions, not only for farmers and laborers, but for everyone.
Got it. So it's a piece of the puzzle.
Piece of the puzzle, exactly.
Yeah.
And you have
the food piece.
and to kind of give the context to it is like when you get 73 organizations together, they all want to, and you're faced with this challenge of trying to author this open letter. You've got to make sure everybody gets their say in it, right? So we had organizations that were representing migrant workers, for example, and farm workers. We had organizations that were representing farmers. We had organizations representing hungry people in the city. And, fortunately, a human rights approach kind of can tick all those boxes.
Yeah.
But it's like, you see the sort of manifestation of that in these points, as those are key pieces of that puzzle, and making sure we didn't leave anybody out in what we're trying to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the language might be a little confusing.
Yeah.
But what you've come away with is ultimately a pretty progressive piece of what was your advocacy?
Yeah, exactly.
Advocacy document.
Exactly.
So I know I find that interesting because when you think of rural communities, when you think of farmers, you don't tend to think of the most progressive group.
No, absolutely.
So if you can get those people on board with these sorts of initiatives, and certainly in the way that it's versed, it seems to prioritize them and to incentivize their participation.
Absolutely.
Then hopefully that can open some sort of door to getting more of these people involved in more progressive policies.
Definitely.
Have beneficial effects for everyone.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. And I have personally seen from these discussions farmers who had no idea what anti-racism was, what anti-racism is, who had no idea of what was kind of going on around Black and Indigenous food sovereignty within the city. They're listening now to people who are involved with that. So they're even in the kind of just networking that's happened from this organization. So people are learning from each other, and they're understanding like, okay, policies that help and benefit me also help with these folks' agenda and what they want in the city.
Right.
So there's a lot of collaboration that's even happening in a more informal way as we sort of try to hammer these things out.
Cool. So let's dig into that sort of background conversation.
Sure. Of course.
You were talking about the pandemic's probably a pretty good place to
Yeah,
start, and
absolutely.
then we can dig a little further into the past as well. So,
Definitely.
Yeah, tell me about the effects of the pandemic on food supply.
So the big one, and this is according to several different resources, but the population before the pandemic of people who were food insecure in our country was around 4.5 million. That is expected to double, and we'll see the latest figures, in the spring when these sort of organizations do their reports. That was expected to double to 8.8, almost 9 million people.
So what is food insecure?
So food insecure is where you have, and I'm sorry if I don't have the precise definition of it, but as I understand from my kind of research into this, food insecurity is where you have some trouble amending your diet with healthy, good food.
Right. So people aren't starving.
People aren't necessarily starving, although it can include people who are really hungry.
Might be, yeah.
But it includes people who are strapped and having trouble finding ways to have a balanced, healthy diet.
Right.
And that's a big jump. 4.4 to 8.8 is a pretty big jump. That's almost a third of our country that is expected, and we'll see the results of that, to be food insecure.
Right.
4.4 isn't a great number, but it's a big leap. So that's kind of part of the background. In particular, we were...
So what's the sort of cause of that? Is that because the pandemic's making food more expensive, or why?
I would say it's twofold, and once again, this is just my interpretation of it, but I would say it's twofold. It's one that yes, the food is becoming more expensive, and healthy food such as fresh produce is becoming very expensive, and two, it's increasingly harder to get. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of combination.
So you mentioned fresh food there. As we mentioned before, we live in Toronto. It's the middle of winter right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I find it hard to imagine that you can even get that much fresh food just due to where we are.
Absolutely.
So that just seems like a challenge.
Yes.
We've got, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches of snow on the ground right now. How does that sort of fit in with this idea of trying to create sort of local farm space, if that local farm space is just going to be under 5 inches of snow 9 months out of the year?
Yes, no, exactly.
Maybe a little less than that. It feels like 9 months sometimes.
Well, and that's important because even though we have this extremely challenging climate to grow food, and climate change is making it more unpredictable and harder to grow food for farmers because their growing cycles are not as regular as they once were, we do have some of because of our natural water systems and aquifers running all through the Oak Ridges Moraine coming into that southern part of Ontario, and then dripping down into Toronto, we have some of the richest farmland in the world.
So when it's growing season, things
are good. Things are growing. We have a lot of land. We have less land now because we've developed a lot of it, but we have a lot of land, and we are capable of growing a lot more. So one of the things I learned about this is that when the going's good, we need to take advantage of it. As we have a long winter, but we have a decent, if not extremely long growing season, and we have the land to actually produce a lot of food. What part of the problem is that, and as we saw this from the pandemic, is that it was a shortage of labor that was a big issue for farmers. Farmers could not plant or had to plow under crops because they did not have the labor necessary to do it, actually cultivate and harvest that produce.
But what's the source of this? Or is there? I mean, I understand there won't be just like a single factor, but
yeah,
what is the sort of consensus from all these different eco-justice and food forums and that sort of thing about why there's a shortage in labor?
So one is that as you said, there's different factors, but I'll just outline a couple of them from what I picked up. One is that farmers don't have a lot of disposable income, so they don't have a lot of money to spend on labor. This is why a lot of farmers turn to migrant laborers because they don't have to pay migrant laborers the same wage they would pay someone who is official citizen or permanent resident of Canada. So that's one factor. Is there's actually, especially farmers who are small scale, which tend to be the ones we want to support and are the ones that are reflective of the people in agriculture involved in the EcoJust Food Network, don't tend to have a lot of money to employ that many workers.
Right.
So that's one factor.
So farming is labor intensive.
Yes, farming is labor intensive, and most small scale farmers are either in debt or barely scraping by as it is. So that's one issue. That's there's already labor issues involved. Now, pandemic happens. It becomes increasingly obvious, and we've seen the results of this, that migrant labor communities get hit really hard with the pandemic because they're all clustered together. Mm-hmm. That knocks a bunch of people out who are already vulnerable, and they can't work in the field in the same way. And also, when that pandemic hit and those lockdowns came, that prevented actual laborers from going out to farms. It prevented farmers from hiring the seasonal laborers that they were ready to do so. And part of the thing about farming is you've got to be ready as soon as the weather hits, you know? You've got to be ready to get in the ground and start harvesting and start preparing for the later harvesting season.
It's labor intensive and time intensive.
And super time intensive. Exactly. So when that lockdown hit, that was kind of like that carte blanche. And the government was trying to figure out what was essential, what wasn't essential, how to make sure things keep functioning. That hurt a lot of farmers as well. Later, they were able to get some labor, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't soon enough.
Right. And so that's how you end up with crops rotting in fields.
Exactly. That's how you end up with crops, in a nutshell. There's more going on, of course, but from my perspective.
So I guess to tie this around a little bit, so I can see how, there are clearly some issues. One of the things that isn't making the full link here for me is to bring this back to sort of this idea of people being food insecure.
Yes.
You're still... Ontario and Canada may be fairly fertile during a particular part of the year. But again, you're no longer providing fresh food after a particular point in the harvest.
Yes.
And this, I guess I'm getting caught up on the idea of fresh food a little bit because it seems to be sort of a part of this food insecurity, and it was part of what we were reading there as well. Yeah. And so the challenge with fresh food it just seems to be an innate challenge to our location and how things grow.
Absolutely. So to respond to that, one of the it's not focused on in particular on the network, but one in particular is a co-op in St. Jamestown that sort of tries to address this question. It's like, okay, it gets really cold in the winter. Say, what happens if you harvest all this food, and you don't consume all of it? What are you supposed to do? So one of the things that they were trying to do and try to kind of create a buzz around is basically showcase classes and help educate people and create some kind of structures around preservation of food. Around food preservation.
Like
canning, exactly, pickling. So that was one sort of community-led approach that was an attempt to sort of wrestle with the problem that you're illustrating. But of course, it's grassroots, it's small scale, But it's kind of like when you operate in a sort of network, like the EcoJust Food Network, what's kind of cool is usually people have thought about all of these different parts of the issue of the food system and the supply chain. And, just the scale might not be there, or it's not always readily available until you start digging for it.
So we're starting to really sort of build a picture of these different organizations that are kind of like filling in these little holes that are being left behind by the way the food system works.
Exactly.
Right. But that doesn't, that doesn't necessarily change how the actual system itself ends up working.
No, definitely not.
So what I haven't seen so far, I'm still behind everything you guys are doing, and it seems like a good idea.
Totally.
But it doesn't seem like you're changing the way the actual food system works.
No. And this is why we're sort of talking about, what keeps coming up in conversations is there's two food systems. There's the dominant industrial agriculture food system, and then our kind of local community-led food system. That's a collection of smaller scale farms and food advocacy organizations and community members within urban areas.
Right.
So, one of the key, issues that we're facing is, we don't have really any inroads into the larger agricultural system that supplies most of our food, unless the only inroads that we've been trying to do is through the policy piece, the advocacy piece. Right? That's where our attempt to kind of change things at a broader level and sort of get some support and funding into this local food system. Because you're absolutely right. we are mostly, when we're in this network, operating in kind of the fringe or non-mainstream food system that is mostly comprised of small-scale farmers who care about the food they produce.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys are, as I keep saying, you're clearly doing some good work, but when we bring it back to sort of more systematic issues of food insecurity,
right,
or whatever other food issues you think there are, it doesn't seem like you have the scale or the reach or even really the plan in order to change the way those sorts of things work. Like, you may diminish some amount of food insecurity, some small amount of food insecurity by doing the things that you're doing. But it seems to me that the food insecurity is being caused by the problems that are innate to the large producers of food.
No, exactly.
Not to the problems that are innate to the local producers that you're working with.
Yes, largely, and part of what kind of the open letter is an attempt to is sort of redistribute some of the resources that governments have and the resources governments are putting into a pandemic to help strengthen this alternative to our really dysfunctional and destructive industrial agricultural system. Mm-hmm. So one of the approaches was to, from a human rights framework, argue that we need to support a food system that is not destructive, that is climate resilient, but also that is pandemic resilient and actually responds to the need of people in the pandemic.
But what would that food system look like?
So absolutely. And that's what we're kind of at this point. We're trying to figure out what that food system would look like as we speak. It's tough. I just have, honestly, we've been kicking this question around. I sort of see, I don't have necessarily the clearest picture on its own, but I see the only way to have a kind of food system that is at once wide scale enough to feed more and more people effectively, but also ecologically just and ecologically sustainable, is people from the food system need to get plugged into the broader issues that are coming up that citizens are concerned with, and vice versa. We're only going to be able to build a food system if, for example, we support and are supported by movements that are not obviously, say, involved in the food system. So, for example, I see, the potential of basic income as a really important step toward achieving this kind of more resilient, just food system that we're concerned with.
But of course, one of the side effects of basic income will be that people are spending more money on food.
Yes.
Most of that money will, of course, end up going towards the people who are making most of
right,
the food.
Exactly.
So I know those. I can see how those things fit together, but you're also going to end up in a position where that wealth is being funneled not to the local farmers necessarily, but
to others, absolutely,
to the people who are selling most of the food.
Definitely, and that's why basic income is part of a piece. We also need to change the subsidy structure around agriculture. Mm-hmm. Who receives the subsidies from the government? Large industrial agricultural farms. Mm-hmm. That's another structure, another political policy structure that needs to change as well. There's other things as well. I've heard that as kind of climate change worsens and it gets more and more difficult to actually grow on open air, large areas of land. Some farmers or some people plugged in that world have talked about we need to shift our farming capacities to indoor vertical farming.
Okay.
Which is interesting as well. So that's I don't know enough about that, and that's obviously not going to happen overnight. But
that's pretty far away from like the fertile earth of Ontario.
The fertile earth of Ontario, exactly. Definitely. Oh. So there are sort of some of these questions that we're trying to answer as well. And I think for me a broader food system needs to actually. You need to have something literally to build it on. One of the things I think about, and it kind of maybe is a bit of a truism, but people need to actually just own land and grow food on it.
Yeah, but we can't all own land and grow food.
No, we can't. But more and more,
most of us don't even own land.
No, exactly. More and more, I think land actually needs to change hands into people concerned with growing food properly for people and maintaining land properly. And that's difficult, right? That's really difficult. But that kind of goes back to sort of the climate resiliency piece of this as well. The way industrial agriculture runs itself on large swaths of land is extremely destructive. But all of that land, if it was facilitated properly, and this is huge amounts of land, especially in a country like Canada and a region like Ontario, has the capacity to actually sink carbon, to sequester carbon.
Yeah, of course.
So, one of the shifts that needs to happen is can kind of the local food system align itself with the broader sort of policy objectives and also objectives of pure survival around carbon sequestration. So, for example, I see if the government gets serious about cutting emissions, one of the ways they can do it is to go after the large corporate agricultural sector and mandate that they change their specific practices on how they treat the land. That has a huge impact. In North America, that could cut our emissions between 30 and 40% based on the research that I know. So that's a huge chunk, And maybe in that, if the way you kind of do that is fundamentally change how you grow food. So that's another kind of very sort of macro view of how we might get to this kind of just food system. But as a network, we're not there yet, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no.
But sorry, I think that's a really good question to ask, and I'm kind of just sort of putting this together for the first time, so I appreciate it. If it's a little messy, it's like, yeah, but thank you.
No problem, man. No, I this stuff is interesting. I think I don't think that much about food, to be honest. The state of the food system clearly has issues. Like I would much rather buy local produce,
definitely,
if I could, and I think honestly most people would.
Yes.
But it's too expensive for most people.
Exactly.
That's a real. In a way, that's kind of the barrier issue. And I understand how, as a small farm, this is a super basic example of economies of scale. If you're familiar with that,
that's right. We've talked about this in our past for sure. I don't know if we've talked about it on camera, though.
No, I don't think so.
But maybe we should go into it. Yeah,
sure. But basically, the larger you are as an organization, as a corporation, the easier it is to the cheaper you can produce a single good.
Right.
Whether that good is a piece of corn or a piece of Lego or whatever it is, once you reach a certain size, then you just have the ability to create more for less.
Exactly.
You can think of it as like one person having a button to press, and the button hits a hammer, and then if they just put in like 10 more conveyor belts behind it, now the button hits 11 hammers.
Definitely.
For small farms, then they don't have access to that scale.
No, exactly.
So they're in a market.
Yes.
They're in a position where they're just not going to be able to produce food that can undercut large businesses.
No, exactly.
So and they're forced to spend more money for
exactly. And part of
sell their food for more money.
Absolutely. And this is the sort of dilemma that we find ourselves in, right? Farmers would love to give their food to people who need it. They just can't afford to.
Yeah, because then they would starve.
Exactly. And the food corps team, we found when we did 5 hours of work at a farm with 5 people, farmers were begging us to take produce home for free because they were like, we can afford to give this to you. You helped save us a day and a half or 2 days of labor, for 5 hours. So that's kind of what was one of the, immediate takeaways from the food corps is, if this can be scaled up, this can actually help these guys out a lot. The question is, and that's why we named it Food Corps, because we're sort of harkening back to the Youth Corps. That's where the name came from. Was one of the folks was like, well, what about the Youth Corps? You know, in the 30s, during the Depression, the government pumped a bunch of money into hiring youth to do public works projects, including farming, and it worked. It, you know, helped save the country that was headed for a cliff, you know, and was teetering on the brink of it in the States.
One of many pieces of legislation.
Exactly. You know, but part of the lattice work that helped sort of buttress the country and turn it.
Got a lot of young people jobs.
That's a good thing. So, you know, and then, but one of the things that, you know, is the tip of this is it's easy to monocrop. So if you're a big farm,
and that's growing a single type of crop.
However, it's getting increasingly harder and harder to do that, and more costly and more labor intensive. And the big swaths of the agricultural industry would not survive and not be able to sell their crops viably if they weren't heavily subsidized.
Right.
So there is kind of a real economic motive to change farming practices.
Yeah, I mean, in a way that kind of sets you up into a catch-22, though, because, you know, one of the things you talked about earlier was wanting these subsidies to move towards lower-income farmers.
Exactly.
But when you're doing that at the risk of actually losing large sectors, you know, the largest sectors of your farming industry, then, you know, that doesn't seem to work out very well.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden Canada's food production drops. We're making way more organic almonds, but you know, we don't make grain anymore.
But part of it is actually like when you increase. One of the things
go ahead.
Yeah, I want to take this.
So I guess the overall idea that I'm trying to sort of flesh out is, you know, for organizations like this that exist.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I think needs to be asked is, you know, does this have to exist in this way?
Right.
You know, could we, like, is there a future where you replace these large farming organizations with a diverse number of smaller farming organizations? Is that actually doable and realistic?
Right.
Versus having the current, you know, 80-20 proportion or whatever it is, large, small. So that, does that seem remotely possible with food?
It's honestly a question I'm wrestling with a lot. The agricultural monopoly is one of the most powerful, in my understanding, in North America. Monsanto, of course, being the big one that was bought by Bayer recently. That has a huge amount of not only economic capital but political capital. I honestly see what potentially happening first is that large industry not being taken over by smaller farms as much as I would like it to be, but sort of from the top down implementing more climate resilient policies in terms of how it grows food.
So what sort of policies would those be?
That would be really simple stuff. It would, you know, from the outset, it would be crop rotation. Right, stuff like that. It would be instead of using, you know, you could still use chemical fertilizers, but instead of using the same herbicides and fertilizers, you'd do something like integrated pest management, for example, where you'd use natural as well as chemical techniques to get rid of pests. And that's another big thing. Another big thing is leaving land fallow, but nobody really wants to do that. But that actually can pay great dividends a few years down the road if you leave the land to kind of regenerate. And the big one is adding organic matter back into the soil.
Right. So having cattle graze there.
Exactly. Having cattle graze there, for example, that we talked about before as being a really kind of cool idea to do. So those are some really simple things that seem to work really well based on my limited knowledge of understanding. But the problem is there's a huge industry not only behind farming, but also behind the the way that we behind the tools that we use to farm, and specifically around pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers.
So if you start using these other techniques instead of herbicides,
Yeah.
Then you're using less herbicides, which
Exactly.
means the herbicide guys are making less money.
Definitely. And we have to remember is these large institutions made their money out of the Great Wars in the earlier half of the 20th century. Ammonia, if you might correct me on this, was used in gas production. It looks like that's my.
That's your father with the things.
Do you want to pause it here and then?
Yeah, of course, and then we'll come back and
we'll come back to that.
Unpolish her up.
And we can. Yeah, thanks, man. This is good so far. No problem. I hope you're enjoying it.
Yeah, man. I think I'm just gonna leave the camera running and I'll just.
Sure. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay.
Of course.
Anyway, I don't want to go off track, but like, is this what you want? You feeling good about this?
Yeah, sure, it's fine.
Okay, good. So I remember what I was talking about.
That's alright. All right, buddy. So you were talking about ammonia, and we just started talking about the sort of almost sort of domino-like relationship between these different farming and farm supplier monopolies.
Absolutely. So one of the big things is that. And if I get this wrong, I'll have to look it up. But basically, ammonia produced in World War II for explosives, also gas as well.
I believe so, for poisonous gas.
For poisonous gas. In World War One, sorry. World War One. After World War II, you got to find a use for all of these factories that produced all of these,
war materials.
War materials. And what
they're banned by the Geneva Convention.
Exactly, and you can't, you got to put them to use because they're huge, and there's a lot of money behind them. So ammonium nitrate is a great fertilizer for crops. Right. So all of these large factories turned into, chemical fertilizer producing plants. And it was sort of like a natural shift because the infrastructure was already there. People were already making money off of it.
And to be fair, ammonia and ammonium are radically different things.
They are radically different things. Exactly.
Despite being very similar, both in name and in actual chemical structure.
Definitely, yes. No, and they are radically different things. But it wasn't a huge leap to switch your production over from one to the other.
Right.
And it made sense at the time. Mm-hmm. Then you have the Green Revolution where...
But the basic idea that you're sort of taking is you have these large sort of weapons manufacturing monopolies.
Exactly.
Essentially, because weapons manufacture is almost entirely done by monopoly. And then that sort of ready-made setup shifts over into the farming industry.
Exactly.
Right.
There's a little bit more to the story with Monsanto, which wasn't previously called Monsanto, producing Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Yeah. And then Mitt Romney being hired as part of Bain Capital to reinvent Monsanto, and actually gave it the name of Monsanto, and kind of telling them your new brand, since you don't want to be associated anymore with chemical warfare, is going to be about creating life, about growing food.
Makes sense.
Exactly. So, and that's how the name Monsanto was born. But all that aside, like, you're absolutely right. There's a kind of marriage between these large war-scale industries and the agricultural sector in North America.
Right.
So there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power behind the fact that, that's why we're still using these chemical fertilizers when we know they are so destructive and aren't actually, it's diminishing returns, right?
Right.
Because they work less and less well and end up
and
damaging
the soil
more and more. Exactly. So you need to buy more and more. Exactly.
But that's the way. So, this is, and I wasn't expecting us to get this much into industrial agriculture.
Yes.
But this is sort of highlighting some of the real issues with the food system.
Yes.
Beyond just the struggles of the individual local farmer.
Totally. Completely.
And it's hard to see. In a way, part of the issue is, of course, we all need food. We have to consume this product.
Exactly.
And I think one of the as we're getting to the sort of end here, I think one of the things that most people rely on that perhaps isn't as prevalent in your community for obvious reasons is that most people really don't think about their food.
No.
They don't think about consuming it. Most people can't cook. In my experience.
Totally.
Most people just aren't that good. They got a couple meals they can make.
Yeah.
But they're not that interested in developing that skill. They're not that interested. A huge part of cooking is, being able to look at ingredients and figure out what the right ingredients are, and being able to find fresher and tastier ingredients, because there's a basic understanding that the nicer your stuff is, the nicer your food will taste.
Right.
So that sort of relationship with food, like people buy, we live in a world where people buy Hot Pockets.
Yeah.
Where people buy, I don't even know what they're called, but those things that you put in a toaster that also are kind of like pockets.
Oh God, yeah.
And they pop up, and the Pop-Tarts. There you go.
Yeah.
The other pot, people buy the absolute junk.
Yeah.
And partly it's because it's cheap, but also partly it's just because people are just putting food in their bodies.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely one of the interesting overlaps between food and other things for me is in terms of sort of physical health and fitness, and just the way putting things into your body reflects on, how you want to live your life and what you want to do.
Exactly.
And what you want to spend your time on.
Right.
And a lot of people don't want to spend their time on food.
Yes. No, for sure.
So I think,
Yeah, and one of the
to say
things,
that,
what my favorite part of the Eco-Just Food Network is the sort of writing-based, communication-based part of it, telling the story of why this matters, because the story is always evolving, and
and trying to get people engaged.
But thinking about these broader questions, and it sort of in the same way that your analysis of what's going on here, by necessity sort of touches on these larger issues. This sort of touches on getting the larger issue of getting people involved in politics in general, like ordinary people.
Yeah.
That's something that I'm thinking a lot about as well.
I think one of the things I've heard from you is that people can get in, that this can be a route to that through the things that they eat.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for the people who are engaged with the things that they eat.
Exactly.
But it can also work the other way around. People who are already engaged in politics can then get engaged in the things that they eat.
Yeah, exactly.
So these different sort of overlapping circles.
And I find when you do stuff on the land, because I know we're getting a little late, but when you start to talk about land and land specifically, people, it starts to connect. And this is very subjective. It's based on my personal experience, but people have a lot of ideas about the land and how land should be used, for good or for ill or in between. And when you work on the land, you have to talk to all of these different people. And when you bring people on the land, people are excited to learn about it, It's that primal connection. And I think by necessity, that's why I really like the food corps. Is it's just on paper, it's just going out and working on farms, but it's also like, participating in this ancient practice of agriculture and talking about it and figuring it out. And
no, it seems like a great idea. I think anytime you can take people to new experiences, and you guys are doing it on a volunteer basis. I'm not. There are a lot of things I hear, and I'm like, people should be paid for that.
Yes,
and honestly, this stuff seems, if you can find a way to keep the volunteer stuff going and to fill this niche.
Yeah.
I think people will just enjoy leaving the city and going to a farm and doing some manual labor for a bit.
Definitely.
As long as the work isn't too insane, then
absolutely.
And they get some fresh produce at the end. I think you got a good thing going there.
Definitely.
All right, buddy.
Thanks, man. This is a good one.
Good, yeah. Great to talk about something you're really passionate about.
Yeah, and I appreciate your perspective on it, as always. But you bring some fresh eyes and some cool, help me think about, what I'm doing in a different way, as always.
Appreciate it. As always, what would you like to see coming out of the EcoJust Food Network in the future? And
absolutely, man. So something I'd like to see is, and this is maybe as personal as well, like, if I'm looking back in 5 years, I want to know, like, where I am in the food sector. Am I actually, talking policy with people? Where is the EcoJust Food Network? What's it grown into? Because it's still really young. Is it just focusing on one of these things that we outlined, or is it, what's going on with it? So just kind of like that.
Of course, buddy.
Yeah. How about you? What's something, if you're looking back in 5 years or whenever, what you'd like to think about?
Mine's pretty simple for this one. I just I would like to put it on camera that I'm gonna try and go to one of these food court things.
Yeah, man.
When the pandemic's over, we're a good bit away from harvest season now.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, you got some time.
Hopefully by the next harvest, it will be the right time.
Absolutely.
But I'd like to come and see what that's all about.
Definitely.
All right, buddy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, man. This was a good one. Appreciate it as always.
Take that. Get my butt off the floor.